It's Friday afternoon. Workers at some of the world's biggest finance firms are leaving the office. But this isn't London, it's Birmingham. It seems strange to start to look at the city and Brexit here, but financial firms employ thousands of people in places like Birmingham, Bournemouth, Belfast. We get dark warnings from London's Square Mile, but they can seem the concern of a few overpaid bankers. However, there are suggestions that the financial impact from Brexit could run much wider. About 2.2 million people in the UK work in finance or related professions. 2/3 of them are based outside the capital, according to lobby group The City UK. Finance accounts for just under 15% of jobs in London. That includes things like banking and trading, insurance, fund management, as well as related accountancy and legal services. Edinburgh is actually higher than that. In places like Manchester, Leeds and Bristol, Cardiff, Birmingham and Bournemouth, finance accounts for about 1/10 of employment.
I love the UK and Britain, even though I'm an American patriot.
No wonder this US banking titan didn't issue his warning about Brexit from JP Morgan's tower in Canary Wharf, but from its campus in Bournemouth.
I don't know if it means 1,000 jobs, 2,000 jobs. It could be as many as 4,000, and they would be jobs both all around the UK.
The problem is what's known as passporting. This allows banks like eager holiday makers to move freely around the European Economic Area with the minimum fuss. British banks can advise clients distribute products or sell services in France, Germany or Spain on an equal footing with local competition. And institutions from places like the US, Japan or Australia can trade freely in Europe from a base in London.
Passporting will fall away, and then all these institutions will be forced to think, well, do I move entirely to somewhere else in the EU, or do I set up a separate operation somewhere else in the EU? I think it is undeniable that that will lead to some movement of jobs and activities out of London.
So what's to stop a bank establishing a token presence in the EU, but letting most staff, be it London traders or bankers elsewhere, stay put?
The issue is that if the core of the business moves to another country, will that country's regulator allow those businesses to be conducted somewhere outside the European Union? And we can only speculate, but in some cases it's unquestionably the case that the local regulator will say, if I'm regulating this business, I want to see it done in my country where I can get my hands around it. And that's not an unreasonable thing for a regulator to say.
Prosperous Norway, part of the European Economic Area, has access to Europe's financial markets. But they've had to sign up to the full suite of EU rules and regulations without much of a say over making them. What about Switzerland? It runs a thriving banking industry from outside the EU.
The big Swiss banks don't operate in Europe out of Switzerland. The Swiss banks have Swiss operations and European operations which are established in London.
So one of the existing models may not work, and the city's negotiating hand doesn't look great when it comes to finding a bespoke deal. Germany may flog us plenty of cars, but in services the UK exports far more than it takes back. But some argue that goods, that's German cars or French wine, and services, our financial expertise, would have to be part and parcel of the same negotiation. That could strengthen the UK's position.
Passporting and the restriction on passporting would effectively be an indirect tariff. It may not be a percentage, like say 10% on a bottle of port from Portugal, but it is protectionism in its softer form. There is absolutely no doubt the UK government, when trying to negotiate a bilateral trade agreement with the European Economic Area, would have to take into account indirect tariffs and treat them as seriously as direct tariffs and negotiate them side by side.
So would the government, threatened with the departure of well-paid jobs, find other ways to help the city?
There are two key areas. One is regulation and the other is tax. So to attract banks and, importantly, the people who work in them, then the UK government could look at reducing personal taxes and corporate taxes. It could do away with the bank levy, for example, which wouldn't be particularly popular, I guess, with the electorate of the UK, but nevertheless, one has to be pragmatic when dealing with external threats such as this.
A lower tax, lighter regulatory environment, music to the industry's ears, and a tough sell to the British public. Finally, where do global banks stand, like HSBC or Standard Chartered, who do business much further afield?
The legal basis on which London-based UK financial institutions operate in many parts of the world are the agreements that the EU has made with various countries, and many of those give EU institutions an advantage. So, for example, when the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement was signed, UK banks, like other European banks, were allowed to open more branches and ATMs than they had been before. That, presumably, will fall away.
The reality is, thousands of jobs wouldn't just vanish from the city. Banks privately bemoan the expense and the logistical headaches of moving staff. It also isn't clear if most jobs would move to one financial centre, like Frankfurt or Paris, or whether finance would fracture, going back into domestic markets. But the largest city institutions do seem to agree on one thing. It wouldn't be a question of if finance would change, if jobs would move. It would be a question of when and how.